Today I've come to Arras in northern France. The sector at Arras, the trenches in this part of the Western Front, were taken over by British and Commonwealth forces in the spring of 1916 as Britain extended its line on that northern part of the Western Front and took over positions here from the French army who'd been battling away in the offensives in Artois in 1915. Arras is not as well known as Passchendaele or Ypres or the Somme, but it was one of the most important sectors in the history of the British Army in France and Flanders. Almost every regiment of the British Army came here, and most veterans who served on the Western Front would have served at Arras at some point. It was the scene in 1916 of a quiet part of the front, but then the following year was the Battle of Arras in April and May of 1917, when the British went on the offensive here against the German Hindenburg line. And then in 1918, fighting returned with the German offensive in March of that year and the final Allied counter-offensive in August and September, breaking the Hindenburg line and bringing the battles here to an end. And I've come today to the Arras Memorial to the Missing and the Faubourg d'Amiens Cemetery, a 1916 to 1918 cemetery with the dead of the fighting at Arras during that period. And I've come here to tell some of the stories of those commemorated here on the Arras Memorial. One of the terrible things about the Great War was the huge level of missing soldiers on every British and Commonwealth battlefield. In most cases, at least 50% of the dead had no known grave. How to commemorate these men? It was unprecedented in previous wars that Britain had fought, but it was felt that it would be unfair to the families of those missing soldiers to have nothing to come and see after the war, and that led to the creation of a whole series of memorials to the missing. And I've come here to the Arras Memorial that commemorates over 35,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who were killed in the fighting around Arras from 1916 until the end of the war, who have no known grave. And all of these memorials are in an order of precedence when it comes to the names. They're not in name order, they're in unit order, in order of the seniority of the armed forces. And we begin here with something that initially looks perhaps a little bit strange. If we look on this panel of the memorial, we can see petty officer, chief petty officer, and able seaman. Now these are naval ranks, but these are all men from the Royal Naval Division. This was a unit that was formed on an idea of Winston Churchill in 1914. It served at Antwerp and then at Gallipoli and then on the Somme, and then in 1917 it fought in the battles of Gavrelle, in the wider Battle of Arras, and later on in the offensives of 1918. And these men are men with naval ranks who served as infantry soldiers in the trenches. So it starts the memorial here with the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and the Royal Marines, both of which were part of this Royal Naval Division, Britain's sea soldiers who fought on the Western Front. I've come to the Royal Fusiliers panel of the Arras Memorial, and one of the things for me visiting memorials to the missing like this is they don't just connect us to the dead, they connect me to the stories of many of the veterans that I've known. And one of those was Alf Razzell, who served with this regiment in the Battle of Loos and in the Battle of the Somme, and then here at Arras, where he was captured in May of 1917. And he left behind on the battlefield a thing that haunted him for the rest of his life. One of his mates, William Hubbard, Bill Hubbard. Bill was wounded in a shell hole. Alf was being led off by a group of German soldiers as a prisoner of war, and he noticed the wounded Bill, appealed to the Germans to help him evacuate him to a medical station, but it was clear that Bill's wounds were fatal and the Germans refused to do so. So poor Alf had to leave his mate behind. And that haunted him throughout his time as a prisoner of war, and he never really knew what had happened to Bill. And then many, many years later, when he was in his 80s, he came here to the Arras Memorial with Jonathan Nichols, the author of the fantastic book on the Battle of Arras, Cheerful Sacrifice, And they stood here and looked up this column to see the name of Bill Hubbard. Now, he's towards the top, and I don't think you'll see it with the kit that we've got, but this name for Alf Razzell was a point in which he had a bit of closure in his war. That story of what had happened to Bill Hubbard had haunted him for all those decades, and finally he kind of slept better after he stood here and brought that part of his war to a bit of closure. And for many of the men, not just the families who came to see names of the loved ones that they'd lost, but the veterans too, these memorials and these cemeteries were so incredibly important. This is a privately published history of the 11th Battalion, the East Yorkshire Regiment. You can see their cap badge embossed on the cover of this book. And they were one of 4 battalions recruited in Hull in 1914, part of the New Army, or Kitchener's Army, the so-called Hull POWs. And they fought on the Somme in 1916, and then in the Battle of Arras in 1917, taking part in the attack on Oppy Wood on the 3rd of May 1917, when they suffered crippling casualties, and many of the men killed in that battle are commemorated on the walls behind me here. One of them is one of Hull's heroes of the Great War, Jack Harrison, VC. He was a local school teacher and a rugby player, and he is mentioned in the book, of course, because of his award of the Victoria Cross, but there is this photograph of him in a sheepskin jerkin taken in a dugout at Hebuterne on the Somme in 1916. And that kind of brings these names alive. We can look up the act of bravery that got him the Victoria Cross for leading his men into battle and attacking the German positions on Oppy Wood and the trenches around it. But it's in books like this that we begin to understand the personal stories of these men, the sacrifice that they made and the heroism that they showed more than a century ago. These books are part of the way we unlock the history and the layers of history here on these battlefields. I've brought with me some objects that connect us to the history here on the Arras battlefields. These are some original British dog tags, identity discs from the First World War. And when people come to memorials to the missing like this, they often ask, why are there so many missing soldiers? Did they not wear tags like this? Well, in that 1917 fighting here, they were officially issued with these 2 tags here. The green one that would stay with the body when they were killed, and the red one that would be taken off and handed in as a kind of proof of death, really. And they contained the details of the soldier, his name, his religion, this man's Church of England, and then his unit, Army Service Corps, Motor Transport, and then his regimental or service number. But so many soldiers were told in the fighting here in 1917 to remove their tags and leave them behind. So a lot of men went up the line with absolutely nothing on them to say who they were. So a lot of soldiers bought tags like this one. And this is one that was actually worn here at Arras in 1917 by a soldier from Barnsley, a miner who had joined the 2nd 5th York and Lancs Territorial Battalion and fought in the fighting at Bullecourt in April and May of 1917. He survived the war and went back home to Barnsley. And they wore these tags round their wrist, sometimes one on each wrist, sometimes even round their ankles, so that if they took a direct hit, and this is the tragedy and the horror of it, that their arms and legs might blow off, but at least there would be something with their name on for their comrades to bury. And in fact, in recent years, when soldiers have been found here at Arras, it's only men that have been found with these aluminium private purchase tags around their wrist that have been identified, and 1 or 2 of those are buried in cemeteries close to Arras. So the unfolding pages of Great War history never cease to turn here on these battlefields of the old front line. When the Arras Memorial was unveiled on the 31st of July 1932, The unveiling was done by Lord Trenchard, who'd been head of the air services in the Great War, because the Air Services Memorial, which is on my right here, commemorates nearly 1,000 men of the Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Naval Air Service, and latterly the Royal Air Force, who served above the battlefields of the Great War and were shot down and have no known grave. There are men from Britain and all of the Commonwealth nations on here, including India, and there are many famous aces of the First World War too. Major Lano Hawker, whose name is at the top left-hand part of the memorial. He was the first Royal Flying Corps pilot to be awarded a Victoria Cross for shooting down an enemy aircraft over Ypres in 1915, and he was then shot down by von Richthofen, the Red Baron, over the Somme in 1916. And Major Edward Mannock is also on here, Mick Mannock, one of the top scoring British pilots of the First World War, who came from a humble background, unlike many of the other Flying Corps pilots, was an incredible engineer, got into a squadron as a balloon buster, shooting down enemy observation balloons, and became one of the top scoring pilots that flew over the Western Front during the Great War. The sad nature of First World War aircraft meant that when they came down in flames, very few of the pilots who died have known graves. They are commemorated here, nearly 1,000 of them, on the Air Services Memorial, a separate part of the Arras Memorial to the missing. I think it's really important to bring original artefacts that connect us to the history of the Great War back to places like this that help us tell the stories of men commemorated on memorials like the Arras Memorial. So I've got with me an original First World War postcard that I rescued from a junk shop many years ago that shows Walter Tull. Tull was a pre-war professional footballer, one of the first black British footballers, and he became one of the first black British officers in the British Army during the Great War, joining the Middlesex Regiment, the football battalion, serving with them on the Somme, then being commissioned, serving in Italy, and then back to the Western Front, and he was killed in the German offensive of March 1918. He has no known grave and is commemorated here on the Arras Memorial. Because he helps tell us the story of the often forgotten black British community that served with distinction in the Great War, many people now come to visit his name on this memorial and pay tribute not just to him as a soldier, but to him as a footballer as well. We can see him here in Tottenham Hotspur kit in the years before 1914. But this name of Walter Tull on this memorial, missing as he was in 1918, helps us tell the wider story of the Great War and the fact that very quickly it became a truly world war. When I visit a memorial like the Arras Memorial with these 35,000 names of men who have no known grave, it brings home the cruel nature of the fighting of the First World War. Men who were missing, the families suffered much longer in many respects because there was always that hope that somehow they had survived. Many people with no grave to go and see after the war almost refused to believe that they'd died, and some held out hope until the very end of their lives. That shadow, that dark shadow of loss, of sacrifice in the Great War hung over every family connected to the million dead from Britain and the Commonwealth, but in particular those who had lost soldiers on the battlefield and who were missing suffered perhaps the longest, with that cruel hand of fate that had made them wonder what had happened to their boy, their brother, their husband, their dad, who had died in battles like this on the Western Front.